Hi, this is Mike Benoit, and today we're going to discuss my book, Tyranny Busters, The Sham and Shame of the Federal Income Tax. And start off with a quote here from Thomas Jefferson. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Now this is the one little phrase that begs some analyzing. What did Thomas Jefferson mean when he spoke of tyranny? And what did he mean when he spoke of tyranny over the mind of man? So, what is the definition of tyranny? Tyranny, if you look it up, it's an ancient Greek word that refers to a government a ruling of the people without the right. Tyranny did not have the connotation of despot. Tyranny could be a very benign rule, or it could be a despotic rule, but it meant control without the right. So when Jefferson refers to a tyranny over the mind of man, now tyranny over somebody's body is pretty obvious. If I grab you and lock you up, put you in prison, then for no reason, that would be a tyranny over your body, controlling your body, and without the right. But what about tyranny over the mind? So how do you control somebody's mind? And again, without the right. If you tell somebody a lie and they act on that lie, then you're controlling their mind. If you fill them up with propaganda that maybe has 80% truth and 20% lie, then you're controlling their mind. If you just load them up with a bunch of your opinions and parade them as fact, then you're controlling their mind. So a hatred, or he called it an eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. So now we got an idea of these different tyrannies. The federal income tax is one of those great tyrannies over the mind of man. And so we're all controlled by it. People actually believe that that's the price you pay for freedom, that you have to be an income tax slave to be free. So there's a tyranny upon the mind there. And I can't tell you how many people I talk to, they say, have you paid your taxes? So they're spreading tyranny upon the mind of man by assuming that they're yours to pay and that there's an obligation to pay that. This book, Tyranny Busters, will break that illusion for you. Now, I've read a lot of books, a whole bookcase full of them, from different authors, all the way from Erwin Schiff to Frank Kowalik to Otto Skinner, and many, many more, that delved into this subject. Yeah, even people as late as, what's his name, Hendricks, and I can't think of his name right now, it'll pop up, that did a year in prison over this. He's an anarchist. I've even debated him. Why can't I remember his name? That must be a tyranny over my mind of some kind. Larkin Rose. Yeah, Larkin Rose. And they have these theories on why you shouldn't pay an income tax, shouldn't have to pay an income tax, and or why where you're not liable because of X, Y, Z. So in going through all of that, and I found that Otto Skinner's works were the best to kind of break through the matrix and the tyranny on the mind of man this way. I wrote this little book, Tyranny Busters, and tried to follow the format of this other great little book, The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And simple truth shouldn't require big, voluminous books. They should be simple. And so we're about to bust some tyranny upon your mind. You may think that the income tax is something that's required by law and you have to do it. And hopefully you'll see that it really is a tyranny upon your mind. This video will help guide you, but watching the video over and over is probably a must. And reading the book over and over is probably a must. I can tell you that 20,000 hours of study on this thing, many times I'm falling asleep, and many times I'm racking my brain to how is this possible, and got to be something else to this. And even all kinds of weird feelings like guilt. If you don't pay an income tax, you feel guilty, then you're not supporting the country. So my first chapter in the book is constitutional taxation, and then interpretations thereof by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, you and I and millions of other people can have opinions on this, but our opinions don't hold the same kind of weight that the Supreme Court does when it comes to a court of law. So Otto Skinner kept on asking these three questions, and I'm doing the same thing, and that is, what is it that's actually being taxed? Is it people? Is it property? Or is it some sort of activity? And Otto Skinner goes on to say there cannot be any intelligent conversation about a tax until the actual subject of the tax is known. And so, to give you an example, when you pay a property tax, we know the subject of the tax is the property that you own. When you pay a sales tax, then we know the subject of the tax is some activity, because you don't pay the sales tax until you purchase the product. So, and then if there's a tax, let's say there's a tax on, everybody in America has to pay $1, then that's a tax on people. So we need to know, is the income tax a tax on people, property, or activities, before you can have an intelligent conversation, because there are constitutional rules that apply. Now, in this chapter 1, I take a look at some of the terms that are in the Constitution, and I pull out the definition of those terms as they were in the period of time where the Constitution was written. And so you can understand the constitutional provisions regarding taxation, and then you can move from there. Terms like plenary are defined. The word tax, the word impost, the word duty, excise, direct, indirect, apportion, uniform, capitation, and custom. And so those are all defined. And I'm not going to define them here in the recording because it'll take too long. But knowing what those terms mean or meant, they mean now actually when you're talking about them in a constitutional sense, because you can't change the definition of a word that would change the meaning of the Constitution. So the word has, as far as the Constitution is concerned, it has to remain the same as when it was written. Otherwise, that would be an improper modification of the Constitution or amendment to the Constitution. So you look at two categories of taxation. There's the indirect tax, and then there's the direct tax. And here's some examples of that. There's impost, duties, and excises. Those are indirect taxes. There's the direct tax, it's land, poll tax, capitation tax, and stock. So a tax on property, tax on people. Those are direct taxes. And more so they're direct because they can't be avoided. There they are. It says if you got property, you can't avoid the tax. An indirect tax happens on an activity. So again, three things in existence. There's activities, there's people, and there's property. So an indirect tax will happen on the occurrence of the thing. For example, impost was a tax that was charged when ships came into harbor. They had to pay an impost tax. Well, it was on the action of coming into the harbor. And duties were goods come in, and of course there could be inland duties too, those are a form of tariffs. So again, indirect and direct taxes, why these are important, because there's rules in the Constitution that talk about how these indirect and direct taxes can be applied, or should be applied. Now, the United States Constitution lays these things out in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. it says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to the respective numbers. So apportionment meant that, let's say, California has 12% of the population, then California's share of a direct tax would be 12% of the total tax. And obviously, if you're going to have a direct tax, you have to know, if you're going to apportion it, you have to know how much money you're after. So, for example, the federal government says we want $200 billion, and we're going to pass a direct tax to do that. Well, in California, having 12% of the population, California's share of that would be 12%. And so that would be collected either by the federal government or the states. How they collect it is not a matter of regard as far as the provision that direct taxes have to be apportioned. All right, so that's what happens with direct taxes. So what happens with indirect taxes? The other clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So Congress is given a pretty powerful, or giving heavy power in regards to taxing in these two sections. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 goes on, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So you need to go back to what direct taxes are and what indirect taxes are, and think again about the question, what's the subject of the income tax? Is it people, property, or activities? And it's a good question to ask the IRS, and I'd like to see how 1,000 people would ask the IRS that, see what kind of answer you get. I didn't get any answer, and it's likely you won't get any answer, because if they come out and say, well, it's an indirect tax, well, then you want to know that the indirect taxes are on activities, so what activity is being taxed? Or if they say it's a direct tax, you want to know the subject of the tax, is it people or property? Because those are what direct taxes are. Now, some folks think that the Constitution on the 16th Amendment changed these old requirements. It's interesting to note that the 16th Amendment doesn't say Section 1, Clause, or Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 is repealed by the 16th Amendment, or the other articles that I read. So it doesn't repeal those things. And then it says Congress shall have the power to impose and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. Now, a layperson reading that would find it easy to say, well, you see, this changes the other clauses of the Constitution. Well, then you have to ask yourself, how could those other clauses still be there and not be repealed if that's the question, if that's the case, if this actually amends the Constitution and this is changing that power? Well, that would be a dilemma. And so what did the Supreme Court say about this dilemma? In Brushaber versus Union Pacific Railroad Company in 1916, case was brought to the Supreme Court on this subject. And Pollock case, this court refers to the Pollock case. The conclusion reached in the Pollock case recognized the fact that taxation on income was in its nature an excise. So if taxation on income is in its nature, it's an excise, and we know excise taxes are on some sort of activity, then a tax on income would have to be on some sort of activity. because if its nature is an excise tax. And then further on in that same year in the Supreme Court, Stanton versus Baltic Mining, Supreme Court said, by the previous ruling, it was settled that the provisions of the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation, but simply prohibited the previous complete and plenary is absolute, power of income taxation possessed by Congress from the beginning from being taken out of the category of indirect taxation to which it inherently belonged and being placed in the category of direct taxation. So the courts, there was some problem where the courts would say, this is a direct tax and void because it found that it was taxing property when, in fact, it was a tax on some sort of activity. So, and not the property itself. Anyway, that's a little complicated, so I won't get into that too far. But the Stanton case, it referenced both direct and indirect taxes, and it also specified that the 16th Amendment conferred no new power. So if that's the case, and people under the tyranny upon their mind, they're under the misconception and belief that the 16th Amendment gave Congress a new power, and that power was somehow able to reach into our labor, every ounce of our labor, and take the ownership of our labor and tell us how much we get to keep and how much we can't, how much they're going to take. There's other Supreme Court cases, and the reason these are more important, in my opinion, your opinion, or Larkin Rose's opinion, or anybody else, is that because, and as long as these cases are extant and they haven't been overruled or overturned, they are considered the law in the courts, if courts will behave themselves and mind the law. In Flint versus Stone Tracy Company, it says, any tax when placed on the right of the man or of the corporation to live is a capitation tax and as direct as any tax can be. So your right to live is predicated on your right to labor. So if they are taxing your right to labor, that's a direct tax and it needs to be apportioned. Again, in Flint versus Stone Tracy, it says excises are taxes laid upon the manufacture, sale, or consumption of commodities within the country, upon licenses to pursue certain occupations, and upon corporate privileges. The requirement to pay such taxes involve the exercise of privileges and the element of absolute and unavoidable demand is lacking. You don't have to do it. You don't have to engage in the activity. You don't have to do that. It's not a thing that's necessary for your existence. So it goes on, it's therefore well settled by the decision of this court that when the sovereign authority has exercised the right to tax a legitimate subject of taxation as an exercise of a franchise or privilege, it is no objection that the measure of the taxation is found in the income produced in part from property which of itself is considered non-taxable. So basically, if it's a taxable activity or exercise of a franchise, some privilege given by government, that they use the amount of income as the measure, but it's not the subject. So that's a key point. If you have a stack of money, and they said because you got a stack of money, we're taxing that money 20%, that would be a direct tax. But if you're engaged in a privilege granted by government, and the government says because of that privilege we're taxing that activity, we're going to measure how much we're going to charge you by way of the income, how much money comes in. So this Flint versus Stone Tracy, it helps unwind the puzzle a little bit more when we learn that Congress can tax on an exercise of a franchise or privilege. And they can label it as an income tax if they want. Okay, in the United States Supreme Court in Tyler versus U.S., A tax laid upon the happening of an event as distinguished from its tangible fruits is an indirect tax. So it's the event, but if it was the fruits they were taxing, that would be a direct tax. All right. So going on before the 16th Amendment, the Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company in 1895. First, we adhere to the opinion already announced that taxes on real estate being indisputably direct taxes, and taxes on the rents or income of real estate are equally direct taxes. Second, we are of the opinion that taxes on personal property or on the income of personal property are likewise direct taxes. Third, the tax imposed by sections 27 to 37, inclusive of the Act of 1894, so far as it falls on the income of real estate and of personal property, being a direct tax within the meaning of the Constitution. So we're going to break here and then pick up in part 2.